Hello, so today what we're going to do is use Blender 2.9 and nodes to make a crack texture, which we can use to create materials like cracked mud or rock or other weathered materials, a whole bunch of different places. And there's a bunch of ways to do this. The first one we're going to do just uses the standard noise texture. I got the basic technique from another YouTube video, which I'll link down in the description below, and then updated for 2.9 and made some minor modifications. So let's go ahead and get started. So first what we're going to do is set up our workspace so that we can actually use it for what we want to do here. So what I'm going to do first is change the rendering to cycles so that we can use some special features in there. We're going to set the feature set to experimental. And if you have GPU compute, go ahead and use it. If you don't, that's not the end of the world. The other thing we're going to do is go ahead and expand this window down at the bottom and use the shader editor so that we can actually see our nodes set up. So get that in your window and make sure you've got the material of your default cube selected. So we've got that. Let's zoom in and move our things so that they're nicely placed in our window. Okay, and now what we're going to do is go ahead and subdivide the default cube. So we're going to go into our modifiers and add the subdivision surface. And we're going to go ahead and click Adaptive Subdivision, which is the mechanism we get out of those experimental features we just enabled. What it's going to do is subdivide the cube up to a certain amount based on how close it is to the camera. So basically, it's not going to subdivide more than the resolution of the camera we have. So we're going to go ahead and turn that on. The other thing we're going to do is update what's shown in the viewport to have 6 levels of subdivision. Because I've found if you don't do that, you can't actually see what's going on. So we're going to go ahead and do that. So now that we're set up, we're going to go ahead and add input texture coordinates so we can get our coordinates. And now we're going to go to textures and we're going to select noise texture. Then we're going to go ahead and plug generated into the noise texture. And for now, we're going to go ahead and pull out the result of that into the input of our standard renderer so that we can just see the pattern before we go ahead and apply it as a bump map or a displacement. So as you can see, we've got the noise there. So now what we're going to do are a couple things. So first, basically what we want to do is take a narrow band of that texture and, to the point where it's creating nice cracks. They look a little bit like the outlines of islands or maybe continents. And then what we want to do is flatten everything else out, so we don't want the rest of the detail. And then we want to turn just those little edges into valleys that we can turn into nice narrow cracks with lots of detail. So there's a couple things we're going to do that. The first thing we're going to do is go ahead and add a math node. And the first math node, we're going to take the output of the noise, and we're going to subtract 0.5 from it. So we're just going to shift it down by 0.5. Now we're going to click on it again, the math node, use Shift D to create another one. And now what we're going to do is subtract the output from 0.5. So if you look at these two, they're basically inverses of each other. So one highlights part of this sphere and leaves the rest black, and the other one takes the bit that's black and highlights that. The reason that we're doing this is that we want the edges of our valley to both go up. So if we just picked a band, like we picked a water level, and we just picked out that much of the texture, then it would only be sloped in one direction, right, uphill. What we want is we want both sides of the valleys to slope up. So what we're going to do is use those two together. So we're going to go ahead and add another math node once I move this out of the way, and use the maximum of the two to combine them together. So go ahead and select, minimum. Go ahead and select minimum, and then go ahead and take the output of that and put that in. And what you can see we have here is now these cracks where the texture rises up in value to either side. So we get this nice height map that we can use to create the valleys. So that's the first step. The next thing we want to do is really get rid of most of the detail, right? So outside of the crack, we don't really care. So what we're going to do is add another math node, Control D, drop it in there, and we're going to use minimum, and then we're going to set a minimum height, and we'll adjust that so that we get a nice narrow path where these crevices are. So go ahead and set that up, and then we'll just dial it down until you see stuff flatten out, as you can see here. Okay, great. So now we have effectively a height map, but we don't want it to be color, we want it to be depth. So there are two ways to do this, and we're going to go ahead and do bump map first. So you can use displacement where it actually deforms the sphere. You can also use bump map. What bump map is going to do is just change the direction that the light goes when it hits the sphere as though it had been deformed. So it's less computationally intensive, which is the nice thing about it, but it doesn't look quite as good. So what you're going to do is take the output of your height map, put it into the height value for the bump map, and then plug that into normal. And as you can see, now we get the texture. Now that doesn't look like a great crack, so we're going to fiddle around with the detail a bit. So as you can see, by upping the detail and the roughness, we can really change sort of how much interesting stuff is going on along these cracks. And then they're a bit fat, so we can try narrowing them down a bit so that we have a much thinner crack that has some interesting edges. So as you can see, we've now got some cracks, but deform is going to look a whole lot better. And the way that you do deform is we go ahead back into vector, and we do the deform node, and now we're going to take the output, plug into the height of that, and then we go and plug it into the displacement input. So now what's happened is it's actually changed the geometry of the node, except it looks the same. Why is that? Well, it hasn't actually changed the geometry of this shape. What you have to do is go and change the settings. So you're going to go into your material, and under your material, you're going to go down to settings, and under settings, you're going to switch this displacement to displacement only from bump only. And now you can see the size actually changed. Now the problem here, of course, is that it's shrunk the object, which we don't really want. We want to put cracks in the object. We don't want to change the rest of it. So what we're going to do is first change our midpoint to 0. So basically what this means is that 0 as an input will map to no change. And then what we're going to do is add another math node here and offset things. So right now we've set it up so that it's a little bit above 0. We're just going to subtract that amount so that it's now below 0. And you can see in the outline now the sphere, well, the cube, subdivided cube, is now within the same shape. So you can fiddle around with these settings to get more or less detail, make your cracks wider, or make the spaces between them larger. And this is a nice way to get cracks. The downside to this is that you don't really get sort of regular cells of cracks or straightish lines. You very much get, you know, the outlines of continents or maybe islands. And so another way to do this, which I'll show in the next video, is using Voronoi. So that's a basic mechanism to create cracks in Blender that you can combine with other mechanisms. I hope you find it useful.